Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guest, and hopefully humor, insight, a different generational perspective, all of that with Katie Halper, who I met as a groupie. Actually, I was on a nation cruise, and she was performing one of those seminar cruises that are usually, well, they can be very serious. I didn't want to say dull. And then we had this a very entertaining, sharp performance by Katie Halper, who, in addition to being a comedian, is a filmmaker. I love that film about the commie camp. Like we could talk
Thanks.
about that. And, went to Wesleyan. I don't know, I guess you were inspired in all of your political activism and insight by Hillary Clinton, who went to the same school. Did you?
No, she went to Wellesley. She went to
Oh, it's
Wellesley.
different. God, I
Yeah,
know it.
she went
I,
to the,
I,
yeah,
I am never any good when it comes to the ruling class watering
right,
holes, but it's
right. She
probably
can't
pretty
remember them.
similar. And you are also a great podcaster. And a lot of people I teach at USC, they don't listen to my podcast, but they do listen to you. So I'm going to score points now having you on this show. And you do your own Katie Halper show, and you are a co host. Is that still going on in Substack now? It used to be with Rolling Stone with Matt
Right.
Taibbi.
Yeah, Matt Taibbi's on book writing leave, so I'm co-hosting now with Aaron Mate,
Oh,
but it's
well,
still
he's
happening.
really good. I've done a
Yeah.
podcast with him. Then with both of them, I have a lot of respect for Matt Taibbi's independence of mind on the whole Ukraine stuff and everything else, banking certainly. So let's just jump to it. You're somebody who started out, I know because I met you when you were much younger, with very good intentions to make this a better world and to use this new emerging media of the internet to accomplish that. And you've been very successful. What have you learned about it? What have you learned about power in America? And where are we now? We seem to be back in the worst days of the Cold War. We're talking about the possibility of nuclear war on certainly in terms of foreign issues, on domestic issues, who have a disaster of increasing income inequality and possibly a great recession, if not worse, and the reversal of Roe versus Wade. So there's a lot to talk about. And instead of my directing you in this, why don't you take over and kind of just tell us what have you seen? What's going on?
What have I seen? Well, the world is a scary place. I feel like I don't know how to make the world a better place. I like the idea of, I mean, I guess with my podcast now, I try to, as corny as it sounds, like elevate voices of people who are doing important things, doing organizing, or have important perspectives. I try to provide people with also, I guess, an anti-war perspective, which is increasingly rare these days. That's been very disappointing. I feel like what I learned was that I learned through, there were a couple like line in the sand moments for me. One was the Bernie Sanders campaign, and one has been Russiagate, and now Ukraine, um, and in some ways Trump too. But the first one was probably about Bernie Sanders. I was a big Sanders supporter, and I kind of couldn't believe that anyone would not be excited, who calls himself a leftist, wasn't excited by him and his campaign. Now, I get when people think he wasn't sufficiently left, but I'm talking about people who preferred Hillary Clinton to him or Elizabeth Warren. I thought that was a very revealing moment.
Why? I mean, they might favor finally a woman president or women's leadership or not want an old white guy again,
Yeah.
you know?
Sure, that's, I mean, if all things being equal, if we had like a bunch of progressive candidates who were equally progressive and one was a woman of color and one was a straight old white dude, yes, I would prefer the woman of color, but that really wasn't the case. And I think that with Sanders, I mean, some people were, I think, seduced by the identity politics of it. And of course, I mean, if you consider yourself a feminist, then you should be caring about issues like minimum wage, which just as shorthand, Bernie Sanders, of course, supported the fight for 15. He wanted to raise the minimum wage. Hillary Clinton, who fashions herself as, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, she didn't support the fight for 15. Just a kind of shorthand example of superficial feminism that we saw in the campaign. But I feel like a lot of people were pretended to be more leftist, and it turns out they actually were either just kind of centrist or had hang-ups around identity politics.
Yeah, and also opportunistic. I mean, after all, I met Hillary Clinton when her husband was governor of Arkansas, and she was doing all of these deals in the richest, potentially richest corner of the state, ignoring the Delta and everything else. And
Right.
there's been a lot of issues. Welfare reform, his great achievement, he
Right.
was bragging about in Arkansas. I spent a lot of time on that, and it was really a way of denying the value of poor people and single mothers. It was horrible, horrible. And on the federal level, it was a disaster. But let me ask you, if we look at the Democrats now, including Bernie Sanders and including Elizabeth Warren, none of them, not a single elected one on the national level that I know, even Barbara Lee, who I've long admired, and a lone voice speaking about up against the Iraq War, have
The
raised any
Afghanistan war.
questions about this drive for an ever expanding war. I mean, where is
Yeah.
give peace a chance? Where is, negotiate? For God's sake, Richard Nixon went and negotiated with Mao Zedong. And the
Right.
world has been a better place for it. He even negotiated with Brezhnev and Khrushchev when he was vice president. Whatever happened to the idea of, yes, whatever you think about the Ukraine, where is diplomacy? Where's concern? And here's a nuclear armed opponent. How do you explain that? You interview a lot of these people, and the few voices that have spoken up, including Aaron Mate and Matt Sahibi and a few others, my God, they get called traitors.
We had a kind of a dress rehearsal for this in some ways with Russiagate, where we saw people become very kind of weirdly neo-McCarthyite and jingoistic and talk about treason and traitors. And then I think that that's something that was very destructive kind of in and of itself. And it really distracted from what should have been a robust resistance to Donald Trump, because they were just going after him for all the wrong reasons. And they were going after him for things that they couldn't prove. And they were going after him for things that undecided voters couldn't have cared less about. And his supporters also couldn't have cared less about. And then we see it coming home to roost, so to speak, with this war in Ukraine, where I think people are just, it is very scary. And it's really scary that, as you said, none of the progressives are speaking out against it. I don't understand why, as you were saying, diplomacy isn't being pursued. I mean, I do understand why. I do and I don't, but it's disturbing and it's embarrassing. And it's really disturbing that the only ones speaking out about it are right wingers for cynical. I mean, not that they have a worldview that I agree with, but it's just pathetic that the left is ceding the ground on this to the right.
Yeah, they've co-opted in a way. Okay, the so-called left, the Squad, and Bernie
Yeah,
Sanders, Liz Warren, have co-opted what used to be a peace movement, and which kept us sane. And it's kind of bizarre. After all, Saddam Hussein was no saint,
sure.
and yet we all felt you didn't have to invade his
Right,
country. Those of us abroad, and I remember Barbara Lee, my congresswoman from the Bay Area. She was heroic and said, "What are we
right.
doing here?" Now, a lot of Democrats went along with it, including Hillary Clinton, of course, and Joe Biden. But still, there was a vigorous peace movement. There is none now. None.
Yeah,
And I think fear has something to do with it. The whole idea, well, we're not Trump, and
yeah,
that whitewashes everybody. Trump washes.
right,
I find this the most. I'm an old guy now, 86. I grew up before the war, but World War II, and
right.
I just find it quite amazing. that there isn't any caution. You got a nuclear armed opponent. Let's say you think Putin is crazy. Let's say you think
Exactly.
he is another, wants to conquer the world or so forth. Well, that's what used to be said about Mao Zedong. But Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, one of the amazingly sane voices now is
I know.
Henry Kissinger.
I know.
And
What a
and I
world.
interviewed Nixon, by the way, after Watergate, and he was writing about giving peace a chance. And I must say, he looks pretty good in comparison.
Yeah.
And I'm not giving him a pass. I was in Cambodia before and after the bombing. I was in both North and South Vietnam. I covered all that. The guy was a monster, a war criminal. I understand all that. But when push came to shove, he favored negotiation. And we were able to get along with what was supposed to be the most feared barbaric communist of them all, Mao Zedong, and the world has been a much better place for it. Where is this the voice of sanity here? This is not left or right. This is people are giddy on the prospect of actually, even if there's going to be nuclear war, bring it on. It's goofy. And
Right.
now, you got Pelosi going to Taiwan. Even the Biden administration knows what is she doing?
Right.
What are you claiming? You're going to liberate Taiwan? The one China policy is over? So, by the way, I want to applaud you. On your shows, you've been willing to discuss these issues. I notice you have a blurb for a new book coming out on the Ukraine, which I guess it's OR Press is publishing, right?
Oh, Medea Benjamins.
Yeah, on the whole Ukraine war.
Yeah.
So maybe we should talk about that. Okay, you meet a lot of people. What do they say to you? They don't care?
You mean the people who don't agree with us?
Yes, but I'm not. I'm a hick here in Los Angeles. you know,
Yeah. No. Yeah. I
I
guess I'm
you
trying to
you
figure out
get
who
you get
you're.
to the Washington and New York circuit there.
Right.
Tell me, what do they say? I mean, yeah, you've got people on your show, and as I say, Matt Taibbi deserves a lot of credit, and Aaron Matt and so forth. But what are these other Democrats that you know and
Yeah.
hang around with? What are they? What are they no longer scared of nuclear war? Do they think it's
Yeah.
winnable?
That's a good question. I think that someone said this to me once, which was that Trump winning for liberals was what 9/11 was for conservatives. Like it was a moment that they could have looked at objectively or looked at in a way that would have made them maybe understand how the world works, but they totally took away the wrong message from it. Um, I think we saw something comparable with the way that liberals reacted to Trump. I think that people's brains kind of broke. I think that they were so disgusted that reason kind of left their minds in many cases, and they just became very reactive and emotional, which is funny because, of course, that's one of the things that they don't like about Trump, right? That he's not a great thinker. But I think a lot of people, it's scary. Like we see this with Assange also. And I'm talking about standard issue liberals who just, believe in I may not agree with you, but I'll fight to the death to defend your right to say it. Not that they actually would do that, but they believed in that idea, at least, of free speech. We see this with people with Assange. They just have this weird Pavlovian response, like, "Oh, they think he helped Trump get into office, so who cares if his rights are being violated?" And I see this from people who I otherwise would respect and who are smart, thoughtful people. I think that Trump winning for some people was such a disruptive moment, and of course, Trump's victory. I mean, or I should say, his presidency. What made it so unprecedented was a lot of it was aesthetic. I'm not downplaying how he was an aberration in many ways, but I also think that some people like to pretend that they're, the way that people talk about the good old days when George Bush was president, as if that was some kind of reasonable presidency. So there's a lot of decorum issues and a lot of Trump washing. You use that term, which I think Samuel Moyn came up with that term, who's a professor of law and history at Yale. I don't know if you've had him on the show, but the way that things are kind of were outsourced out to Trump as exceptional, when so much of what Trump did was stuff that was already being done just without a nice finish on it.
Time for a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
How can you support KCRW? Lots of ways. Subscribe monthly, just like you do to streamers, publishers, and that box for your dog. And donate your car. Vehicles don't last forever. When it's time to retire your car, truck, boat, motorcycle, RV, or riding mower, hit us up. We'll take it off your hands and turn it into great radio. Just go to kcrw.com/cars.
We're back with Scheer Intelligence and our guest. Let me just frame this a different way. In terms of our own careers, I'm twice your age, but we do well. I can't speak for you, but I assume your shows are popular. You do a lot of interesting work. You work with some real stars like Matt Taibbi, so forth. Ironically, I actually came out of the pandemic. I didn't die. That was a close call given my age. Nonetheless, I can't complain. Yet we're living in not only a world, and I shouldn't say not only, in a world of great pain, trouble, suffering, but a country, the most prosperous country in human history, has so much anxiety, difference that, the most recent reliable polls show that half of the people, both Republican and Democrat, in almost equal numbers, don't believe democracy is going to survive. And they don't believe it's working. And they go for, a dangerous demagogue from the right, not the first time, but they also go for what I would consider just as dangerous, although more effective and more subtle, demagogues from the so-called Democratic progressive side. And the big issues that concern us go not only unaddressed, you're not allowed to even bring them up. If you want to bring up questions about war and peace, you'll be called a Putin agent, and you'll probably be banned from the internet that just a few years ago we could celebrate for all of its faults as just an open forum, that where people could communicate. That's gone. People get silenced on the internet, and they don't even know why and what they can do about it. On the economic issues, the whole the Democratic Party program has come to naught. And once again, we're arguing about, it's the Supreme Court and who's going to appoint. I'm not putting that down, but we're really concerned about getting the Supreme Court because we don't think we can get many state governments to do the right thing or even get the legislature, the federal legislature to do the right thing. So, let's assess this moment. Where are we? How will we get here? And is it, we could, can you get on MSNBC? Do they actually, I don't know, I don't watch it anymore. Do they interview a Matt Taibbi?
No, definitely not.
So let's talk about that. The state of media. We have the illusion of freedom, and we did have, for all of its contradictions, the internet gave a great forum. Well, now, increasingly, I'm talking to people, no matter their credentials, they could have been with mainstream media for much of their life. But if they don't line up now, they become non-persons.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really scary censorship, self-censorship too, but just outright censorship or, with platforms like Twitter or Facebook, without a lot of transparency, can remove people's tweets or remove links to people's work. We see that, and again, it shouldn't be. I think that Trump just became this relative, like this reference point, and for so many people, all of their morality and their ethics were kind of built around Trump. And so if something was good for Trump, then it was evil. If something was bad for Trump, then it was good. I mean, I saw this with people upset that he had, a nice interaction with Kim Jong-un. They wanted him, I guess, to be more belligerent, which never seemed to make sense. Going back to what you were saying earlier, with even if you think, Putin's an insane person, what is the end game? What do you want to have happen? I would often ask that question during Russiagate when people would accuse Trump and Putin of being, romantically involved, which was a stupid homophobic trope that people should have been better than, but a lot of people got on board with that. But I'd say, okay, so you think Trump is an unprecedented existential threat with dementia, who's erratic, is a Cheeto Mussolini. You think that Putin is an evil dictator. Both men have nuclear power. What is the end game? Why would you want Trump to be more aggressive with anyone? And we're seeing the same thing now. Trump is not in office, but it's the same kind of thinking, which is this weird, irrational embrace of militarism. And it gets very jingoistic and embarrassing.
Yeah, and they are quite willing to destroy anyone who disagrees with them. I mean, for God's sake, to my mind, the one test case that you really have to assert is the Julian
Yeah,
Assange one.
I agree.
Anybody who claims to be a journalist, whether they're left, right, center, whatever, and they don't recognize that what Julian Assange was basically doing was giving the media and was a part of the media collecting information that we had a right to know about in order to have a democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how. I mean, the major news outlets used his material. He didn't fabricate it.
Right.
It was material we needed to understand, just as with Edward Snowden, to understand the extent of a surveillance state, the extent to which even private organizations were invaded, the extent to which our own government was committing war crimes. And yet, where are even the major civil liberties organizations? Right. I know on one of these shows I criticized Penn for not speaking up enough about this. And the next thing I knew, they were writing a letter to the station that carries the show, challenging me and everything. And where have they done it? Where is it? And there's this incredible intimidation. There's an intimidation of places like Facebook and Google that they should censor more. You know, I don't think I've, in my 86 years on this earth, lived in a time quite like this in this country, where the call for censorship is fashionable. It's called real news. Everybody else is doing fake news. Anybody who disagrees with your narrative, they're illegitimate.
Yeah,
and they get away with it.
It's also such a weird. It's often projection. Like, they can't imagine people have independent views for any other reason than they're on someone's payroll or they want to get clicks. I mean, I get accused of this all the time. Oh, you're a grifter. This is for, what are you, a Putin lover? Or you're just doing it for clicks. And again, it's like you're just projecting your own understanding of the world and your own value system onto me because you do things for weird ulterior motives, not because you actually believe in them.
Well, the whole thing about Putin lover, I happened to, when I was working at the LA Times, I was in the old Soviet Union when Gorbachev was in power there. I interviewed a lot of people, and I was familiar with Yeltsin and the St. Petersburg group where Putin came out of. And during that whole period, Putin was the guy, he was the sober Yeltsin. And he was a guy who was and he was certainly a strong anti-communist. He saw through the whole system. He was bringing back he was a conservative. He was bringing back the Orthodox Church, bringing back a sense of pride in Russia and so forth. And they all loved him, you know. And if you said something about Gorbachev, Gorbachev was unpopular, right? Because he was telling people what they didn't want to hear and so forth. And now these same people, because Putin is a nationalist, whatever else he is, he's certainly asserting some national interests and can challenge our narrative in the same way as leadership of some other countries, including China. They become the enemy. Yeah. And I have not been in a time like this. I mean, where, there's no complexity. There's no nuance.
Right.
The sophisticated position is to deny complexity. Now, the reason I'm talking to you about this is that you are much more plugged into this media world now. I used to be, but you're there, at the scene of the crime, really, that Northeast corridor. And I don't know how these people get away with it. I mean, for example, let's take one thing. The old horrible Cold Warriors the Project for a New American Century, the
Yeah.
neocons, they're back in this government, in the State Department, not just in the Defense Department. The people who are designing the whole Ukraine policy are the people who have wanted a war with Russia, whatever the system is, and certainly with China. They've wanted it for a long time. They are now in fashion and in power.
And on the media.
Oh, on the
Yeah,
media.
like Will Krystal, who's always on MSNBC.
Yeah, and we're not allowed to mention that MSNBC is a sort of a corporate mouthpiece. That we're not allowed to talk about the enormous salaries
Yeah.
that people make, and we're not ever to talk about selling out.
Right.
I don't even know if selling out is appropriate because these people seem to all be true believers.
Right. It's not even. Yeah.
Well, how did they get? I don't know what happened. One would have thought. I actually thought that with the collapse of communism in Russia and the recognition that China could be a useful capitalist country as well as a communist one, and after all, I spent much of my life trying to say we didn't need to be fighting in Vietnam. Now they favor communist Vietnam as a place to make iPhones instead of China because the Vietnamese communists are thought to be good communists. The Chinese communists are thought to be bad. Why? Because they care about what their future for their people or something. It's hard to tell, but it's a time of irrationality, and
Yeah.
and we have to pretend it's not,
Right.
or we're considered purveyors of fake news.
No, I mean, I'm not quite as chummy with. I feel like, especially now, there's not the same. Like, I'm based in New York City. I'm from New York City, but I'm not. I'm kind of in the. I guess I have a media circle, but I also am considered persona non grata to the extent that people know who I am by lots of media elites. But what's weird is that I do think that there's, and I don't want to like oversell this similarity because I'm not someone who believes that like populism from the right and the left is the way to go. I'm not a right wing populist. And of course, for someone like Thomas Frank will tell you that that doesn't even exist. But I do think what's weird is that I'll agree with people on the right sometimes more than with liberals, which is a weird phenomenon. Not about everything, but certain issues like censorship and again, not all of them, but I guess kind of people who are more on the libertarian right side of the spectrum, which is weird. Like but it makes sense at the same time.
Well, I mean, okay, we're going to wrap this up, but I think we're really at the limits of careerism. And I think again, you're even younger than half my age, but I think one thing all of us in the media struggle with is to what degree will you accommodate power and wealth, and to what degree will you play the game? And now there's actually a real whip out there. You don't play the game, and they're going to get you as a traitor.
Yeah.
And I noticed, like in the case of England now, they got this blogger in the Ukraine. I don't even know his name. They froze his assets.
Wow.
Because he reports a different way.
Oh, yeah. That's another thing that we didn't even get into is how PayPal was freezing assets of like Consortium News and individual journalists, Alan McLeod. That's another really scary thing.
Right. And the scary part is not coming from the traditional Republican right wing. I'm sure they're cheering it on, but it's coming from so-called liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
And here I want to get back to us Bernie supporters. Where is Bernie on this? Why isn't he speaking out? Why isn't Elizabeth Warren speaking out? They know you can't.
Warren is less surprising to me than Bernie. I mean, Warren is less surprising and less surprising, less disappointing than Bernie is, because she's never been particularly progressive on foreign policy, and of course, Bernie's never been as left as like you and I would have liked. But Aaron Mate talks about this a lot. He says that it's Bernie's foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, is giving Bernie his advice and has a view that, I mean, I don't want to speak for Aaron or Matt Dusk because I haven't looked into it, but I know that Aaron, whose view on this I trust, says that he's getting his advice from this advisor.
I think it's not a left-right issue anymore. We all agree that we have to have international
Right.
cooperation, or you can't deal with the climate
Right.
crisis, which is right in our face right
Yeah.
now. Okay, you can't do it, and we don't have the time to be screwing around. Yet we are in a situation now where we were urging the Europeans to fire up their coal plants. Germany to get your nuclear back, follow the way of the
Yeah.
French. I mean, I was at Chernobyl a year after that explosion. If anybody tells me nuclear power plants are the way to go, my God, we
No.
haven't learned that. So, we forget about and you cannot have this huge military and everybody else building up a huge military. I mean, that's the greatest waste of resources and polluter and everything else. And we've forgotten that whole agenda, and it's, again, I use this word giddy. It's like we don't have adults watching the store. What is going on here? And now you want to pick a fight with China over Taiwan again? You want to go back to that? I mean, Nixon was able to work out some kind of accommodation. You want to break it? And now I have to sit here on my memory of my great late friend Christopher Hitchens, who wrote such a savage and I thought at the time accurate analysis of Kissinger. I now look at God. I
I
hope
know.
Kissinger says something more.
I know. It's very scary.
I mean, yeah. And then I wonder, what's I use this word. They're drunk on their
Yeah.
careerism. It's like we're going to get these guys because they almost got us, and they're bad guys, and we're now going to do it to him. Otherwise, they're going to have the hearings and find crimes against us,
Yeah.
and the world be damned. So I'll let you have the last word here, but I don't think this is left right. I think this is are people serious? Do they really care?
Yeah.
Do their words mean anything? And this, look, when we had a strong anti-war movement, and you could be against being in Vietnam without saying that the government in Hanoi was
Sure.
enlightened and liberal. Some people thought it was, but that wasn't the main thrust of the. It was that we didn't need this war, that
Right.
the war was not justified, that we could live with these people. And sure enough, Vietnam is still communist, and yet we're hoping now they'll take some of the iPhone business away from China because they're the good communists. So, how come we were able to get along, even with Stalin, for God's sake, but we can't get along with Putin? So there's nuttiness in this. And the idea that we've turned our back on diplomacy
Right.
and that war, and who gets killed in the war, they're always going to be the vulnerable civilians, whether they're Ukrainians or Russians or Afghans, and people have forgotten that. And we're giving the most sophisticated weapons because weapons will solve the problem. I mean, think about it. We are at a point now where we think arming and getting most high-tech weapons and rearming everybody instead of trying to get to a negotiation. And that's endorsed by social democrats, by liberals, by progressive people, as well as by reactionary people. And in fact, you're actually getting more pushback from the right than you are from the so-called left. I don't know. That's my editorial. It's a really frightening time. I'll let you have the last few minutes here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with what you said, and I think it is scary, and I think that it was an unfortunate chronology of having Obama and then Trump. People were like, the left was a little asleep at the wheel with Obama, and then didn't know how to react to Trump and focused on the wrong things and became very reactive again. So everything was how was defined by its relationship to Trump. And I think that it is scary. It is weirdly just anti-survivalist to have this gung-ho attitude towards war. And we saw, I mean, what was so weird was the media was pushing for no-fly zone. I mean, you even had people like from the Biden administration and people from the Pentagon were kind of like, are you serious? Do you realize what you're asking for? But you had a whole room of journalists basically impatient because with the Biden administration for not calling for a no-fly zone. I don't know if it's I mean, when you talk about careerism, I think it's an interesting question. What motivates people, whether they're true believers, they've drunk the kind of jingoist Kool-Aid, whether it's just self-censorship, whether it's just careerism. I think sometimes, people are often, it's hard to distinguish those things because you're paid to not talk about certain things. So you may just start not thinking in a certain way because it makes your life easier. But it's a scary time and people have to band together. I guess you're right. It is there is some we can't afford to be siloed. So we do have to work with as big of a coalition as possible. Because if not,
I just think that we have to be willing to do what you have been willing to do and what Matt Taibbi and others. And, I know Glenn Greenwald's not everybody in the fashion of the moment, but I love his independent spirit and willing to speak out. I just think whether they're doing it out of stupidity or jingoism or intimidation or careerism, when people make millions of dollars by being in mainstream media, I understand that. But to not worry about the fate of humanity,
I know.
That's what's going on here. The place is burning and burning down. And then what are we doing? Playing games here? I don't know. Well, all right. Katie Halper, let me leave it at that. I want to thank Christopher Ho and Laura Kunduzarian, our producers at KCRW, for putting these shows up and for the station for hosting it. I hope they continue. I want to thank Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, for insisting I interview Katie Halper, not go another week without interviewing Katie Halper, and I did, and I'm glad I did. And also all the students, I have a lot of them keep asking me to interview you, so I'm glad I did that. And Natasha Akimi Zapata, who does the introduction and stewards this show. And I want to thank the JKW Foundation, which is the name of a very independent journalist, Gene Stein, helps fund these shows. See you next week with another edition of Scheer Intelligence.
C'est payer, balayer, oublier. Je me fous du passé avec mes souvenirs. J'ai allumé le feu, mes chagrins, mes plaisirs. Je n'ai plus besoin de balayer les amours avec leur trémolo, balayer pour toujours.